And hoping you can all see those okay. Thank you for the invitation to join the seminar today. It's great to be here. As James has introduced, I'm the Research Integrity Director from Springer Nature. I'll start by giving you a bit on my background. I grew up in Australia, did a PhD in plant physiology and molecular biology, and I started work straight out of PhD on a small primary research journal there in Australia. Gosh, about 18, 19 years ago now, I moved to the UK into entry-level editorial position at Nature Reviews, which are a portfolio of journals that as guests publish secondary review content. I spent almost about a decade in the Nature Reviews division, so I worked my way up to eventually run that division, which at that time had about 17 journals. Having worked on secondary content for a long time, I was looking for a new challenge, and open access was the big new thing at that time. And Springer Nature, which was Nature Publishing Group at that time, had recently launched a new journal called Scientific Reports. As Chris mentioned in his talk, it fell into what a lot of people regard as the mega journal category, so a high volume, multidisciplinary journal with an open access business model, quite like PLOS One for those of you who are familiar with that journal. So in about 2014, I moved to Scientific Report. It was a relatively new and young journal at that stage, and I became the head of editorial and publishing for the journal. In the 5 years that I was at Scientific Reports, it went through quite a rapid growth phase. This was primarily driven by a large jump in the impact factor. The impact factor jumped to above 5 from a baseline of about 2.5, and that, not surprisingly, attracted quite a large increase in submissions. Over a 6-month period, we went from about 500 submissions a month to a maximum of about 4,500. So it was quite a logistical challenge, but along with the logistics of just processing that number of manuscripts, obviously the number of problematic manuscripts increased at the same time. And because I was the head of that portfolio, most of those problematic manuscripts landed on my desk. That put me in a really good position to take on my current role, which is Director of the Springer Nature Research Integrity Group. Let's take a look at who's responsible for research integrity and publication ethics, and indeed, what are we even talking about when we use those terms? Upholding integrity during the publication process involves taking personal responsibility for one's own actions as an author, obviously. It can also entail responsibility for other people's actions, though, particularly when you're taking on the role of a corresponding author on behalf of a group of co-authors. Of course, and being an author is not the only role that a researcher can take on in the publication and research cycle. That personal responsibility extends to other roles: editor of a journal, peer reviewer, reader, even if you're working as publishing staff on a particular journal. Another important aspect is being willing to report problems when you spot them. I think it can be very tempting to pretend that you haven't seen something. The difficulties of reporting and potentially becoming involved as a whistleblower are quite confronting for some people. Any one of the stakeholders on this slide can allow a problem to slip through if there's a failure in the quality control part of the process that they're responsible for. And that can happen knowingly, unfortunately, via deliberate misconduct, or it can happen unknowingly. Let's try and take a look at how many problems slip through. Before we look at some numbers, it's really important to stress a couple of caveats here. There's no single reliable source of good historical data on these types of issues. Further, we obviously only have data on issues that we've been made aware of. Professionals who work in this area have a sneaking suspicion, actually it's much more than a sneaking suspicion, that the issues that we're aware of are actually pretty much the tip of a large iceberg that we're slowly chipping away at. Having said all of that, the Retraction Watch database that some of you may be familiar with is one of the most reliable sources of data that we have to hand at the moment. And the data that you see on this slide are primarily drawn from that source. You can see that the proportion of papers that's been retracted each year essentially doubled between about 2013 and 2019, and it's been levelling off somewhat since then. Of course, there's fluctuations year to year for various reasons, and there's also geographical fluctuations that you can see there. All of that said, the retraction remains a relatively rare phenomenon. There's generally just a few papers per 10,000 that are retracted each year. And interestingly, a small number of authors are responsible for a disproportionate number of retractions. According to the Retraction Watch database, about 500 authors are responsible for about 25% of all retractions. Of course, this speaks to retractions that are underlain by deliberate misconduct. It seems that once a researcher tries something that's a bit iffy and gets away with it, they have a tendency to escalate that type of behaviour and apply it to any of their future publications. The differences geographically in retraction rates are not significantly different. You can see that they fluctuate over time, and that probably reflects local differences in training of researchers, general awareness of research integrity problems, and infrastructure, and actually government mandates in some areas as well. As I alluded to before, it's not straightforward to determine whether these types of issues are related to honest errors or deliberate misconduct, or some kind of grey area in between. And I need to stress that generally publishers don't focus their investigations of research integrity and publication ethics issues on determining whether the cause is honest error or deliberate misconduct. Most publishers will focus their attention on correcting the published record rather than dispensing punishments or assigning blame per se. Again, data from the Retraction Watch database shows that there's about, based on the scant information that we do have, there's about a 50-50 split in the proportion of issues that are related to honest error versus deliberate misconduct. Why don't publishers spend more time determining if a problem is related to honest error or deliberate misconduct? Frankly, we don't have access to the materials and evidence for most cases to make that determination. We rely heavily on authors, their institutions, their collaborators to provide that information to us, and it can be very difficult to extract that information. It's generally a researcher's institution or funder that's better placed to make a determination of honest error or deliberate misconduct. But there's a responsibility on the publisher to report the issues to the institutions and the funders so that they're aware that they may have a problem that they need to investigate. Taking a look at my team, which I hasten to add, not all publishers have a dedicated research integrity group. Upholding research integrity and publication ethics via standard quality control is a standard part of every editor's role. So at smaller publishers, that responsibility is subsumed into the day-to-day role of a working editor. For larger publishers, such as Springer Nature, we supplement that expertise of individual editors with this dedicated research integrity group. You can see Springer Nature is quite a large publisher, so I have 11 staff in my team. You might think of us as a central advisory service. We serve a very, very wide variety of journals and books, also databases and magazines. And as I mentioned before, it's part of the day-to-day work of an editor to take care of straightforward research integrity cases. But editors who don't have a lot of experience or who need some advice on a very complicated case, they need someone with a bit more expertise that they can come to, and that's where our team comes in. So the bulk of what we do is what we call casework. We're investigating the report of a particular problem on a published manuscript or a manuscript prior to publication. Think things like plagiarism and authorship disputes. A key word to take away from this slide is that teams like ours are an advisory body. We give best practice advice on how to investigate and resolve these issues, but in line with the concept of editorial independence, it's ultimately up to the editor-in-chief of a particular journal or their equivalent on a book to decide on what action will, or in some cases will not be taken. We're also involved in many other things at a company like Springer Nature. Often my team is the first to become aware of a new type of research integrity or publication ethics problem, and will realise that Springer Nature doesn't have a policy to address that particular problem, and so we need to do some policy development work. We also consult heavily on things like changing workflows or developing new submission systems. We want to make sure that those systems and workflows are as tight on quality control as they can be, so that we're not letting any research integrity issues crop up. So it's a very busy, very interesting and very diverse role for anybody who's interested in that type of work. I can highly recommend it. Our working principles, which I think we share with most reputable major publishers, as I mentioned before, we're very focused on maintaining the reliability of the scholarly record. Punishing authors who may have committed misconduct is not our aim per se. We base our advice on industry best practice, and here I hope a lot of you are familiar with the Committee on Publication Ethics, which actually all three of the speakers in today's session are involved with. So Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE. COPE was started by a small group of medical journal editors as a collaborative way of sharing experience with how to deal with research integrity issues. It's grown into an organisation that's at the forefront of setting standards. It's important to note that it's not a regulator. Some people do misunderstand the mission of COPE as a regulator, but that's not the case. Other principles that we use within the Springer Nature Integrity Group, and some of what Chris has spoken about in the previous presentation speak to this, are openness, positivity and transparency. They're interesting adjectives in this space, but we often find that discussing these types of issues can become quite fraught and confrontational. We're very careful to be non-accusatory when we're asking an author for input if an issue has been detected on their paper. Prevention is better than cure. I mean, it's an obvious catchphrase to use in this space, but traditionally publishers have reacted rather than being proactive about detecting these type of issues. We've waited for somebody to detect a problem with a published paper before we've done anything about it. I think partly that's driven by a traditional lack of awareness about how widespread some of these issues are. As we're becoming more aware of exactly how widespread and actually egregious some of these problems are, publishers and other stakeholders, institutions and funders and indeed governments are much keen to take a more proactive approach so that we detect these issues as soon as possible after a paper is submitted and prior to publication. Some of the tools that publishers will use to detect problems before publication. Plagiarism detection software, a lot of you will be familiar with. There's starting to be some new tools to detect image manipulation, which a lot of major publishers are looking into using. Duplicate submission checks so that we can avoid duplicate publication. We've started to do some work text mining using keywords to start detecting problematic features, and actually automation or semi-automation of these checks is becoming an increasing focus for a lot of large publishers. Obviously, the more we can automate these checks, the faster and more efficiently we can process manuscripts and maintain good author service. But it's important to note that with most of these tools, they're very helpful to have technology and indeed some degree of automation, but there's no replacement at the moment for human intervention and oversight. If you get, you simply can't rely, for example, on the percentage of crossover that's indicated by plagiarism detection software to make a decision as to whether you or shouldn't publish a manuscript. You need a human to interpret the data that's coming out of those tools. Having said that, I do feel that the potential for artificial intelligence in this space is quite high, and I'm quite excited to get started working on that a bit more at Springer Nature this year. Let's take a look at who reports problems. There's a wide range of people. You can see some of them listed here. Sometimes people who are reporting issues to journals and books and publishers will use their own names. They may ask for their names to be kept from other stakeholders within the investigation process. Some people submit complaints using pseudonyms or who choose to remain anonymous from the beginning. At Springer Nature, and I would say for most major publishers, we don't impose rules about people revealing their identity to us. We will investigate any issue that's brought to us, regardless of who's reported it and whether they're using their own name or a pseudonym or indeed are remaining anonymous. The number of people reporting complaints is steadily increasing, steeply increasing. I'll show you some numbers in terms of caseload at Springer Nature in a couple of slides. I think this is a reflection in general of increasing awareness across research communities about these type of issues. People are much more willing to report them. There's pockets of communities who are growing up, semi-professional whistleblowers, if you will, who are using their skills to scan large swathes of the literature to detect problems that nobody's been able to detect before, all of which is contributing to quite a steep increase in the number of cases. If we look at the casework that my team handled last year, we tend to break our caseload down into what we call standard and large cases. Last year, we had about 1,300 standard cases that were brought to our team for advice. Keep in mind that that doesn't include any cases that an individual editor or staff member will have taken care of themselves. So this is indeed an underestimate of the standard cases at Springer Nature last year. Most of those cases, you can see a breakdown of the types of issues. Plagiarism and duplicate publication, data errors, and indeed data fabrication has become much more of an issue in the last couple of years. Authorship disputes, issues around ethics approval and consent for human research participants, and problems with the peer review process. And as I mentioned before, image manipulation is climbing up the charts recently as well. In terms of the breakdown between journals and books, 90% of the cases that were reported to our team last year are on journals as opposed to books. And unfortunately, most of those cases involve content that's already been published, which is why we need to do much better on those preventive projects that I mentioned previously, because we really should be detecting these issues prior to publication. I mentioned the split between standard and large cases. What do we mean when we're talking about large cases? We're talking about large scale, often systematic manipulation of the peer review and publication process. Think paper mills, for those of you who are familiar with them. Large scale theft of identities. Unfortunately, we do see some editor misconduct. We see some black market sites on the dark web where authorship is for sale on accepted in principle papers. And anything to do with a legal issue, we also categorize as a large case. And I should mention that it is increasingly common for authors confronted with an issue in one of their papers to come back to us with a threat from a lawyer. That slows down the process incredibly and mostly doesn't result in a court case, thankfully, but it is becoming becoming increasingly common for lawyers to become involved in these investigations and their resolution. At the moment at Springer Nature, we have about 40 large cases on our books, which doesn't sound like a lot, but each of those cases can involve up to 500 papers. So we've got about 1,500 papers total under investigation at Springer Nature as part of these large case investigations. What does a typical investigation involve? I hesitate to use the term typical investigation because they're incredibly diverse, but generally a potential problem is being detected by a reader, a peer reviewer, or an editor. Generally, a single problem on that paper will be detected. As far as possible, our staff and editor-in-chief use self-service resources that my team have generated, flowcharts, template letters, for example, to investigate that case and resolve it themselves, hopefully without the need to escalate to my team for advice. As I mentioned, anyone can escalate a difficult case to my team for advice. What we will do is we will analyse the full manuscript and peer review history of that piece of work. We will look for any potential problem, any and all potential problem with that paper. We won't just focus on the issue that was reported to us. We request explanations from authors. We do things in a very non-accusatory way. We're often relying on authors to provide us with investigation materials such as raw data, patient consent forms, ethics approval forms. Obviously, if we're antagonistic towards authors, they're not going to engage with that process. Very often, as I mentioned, there's a legal consultation. At the end of the day, we send our understanding of the case and our recommendation for a step-by-step best action plan to the editor-in-chief of the journal, and the editor-in-chief makes the final decision on what action, if any, will be taken. What actions can be taken? There's a wide range of actions ranging from nothing through to rejecting a manuscript, obviously, if it's pre-publication. Post-publication, we're talking about things like corrections, rebuttals via letters to the editor, an editor's note, an editorial expression of concern, a retraction. For increasing number of cases, we'll report them to the author's institutional funder, particularly if we suspect deliberate misconduct or very widespread misconduct. And as I mentioned, legal defence. In rare cases, we do end up in court defending our decisions to retract papers. How long does it take? If you speak to the average whistleblower and anybody involved in these cases, including myself, it takes way too long. It takes way too long for a variety of complicated reasons that I won't go into. One of which is that a lot of publishers don't invest sufficiently in staff or processes to conduct these investigations, and that includes Springer Nature. What I will say is that it takes as long as it takes because we won't compromise on the quality of the investigation. We want to get it right first time. We don't want to retract a paper and then find out that there was a problem with our investigation, which means that we shouldn't have retracted that paper. What's hampering progress? As I mentioned just now, lack of investment by publishers and other stakeholders in detecting these problems sooner in the research enterprise. There's a dramatic underestimate of the extent of the problems. I don't know if any of you are shocked by the numbers that I've put in front of you. If you are shocked by the numbers of cases that I've put in front of you, keep in mind, I said at the beginning that I think that's the tip of a very large iceberg. If we proactively went and trawled the entire historical corpus of the scholarly record, we would find orders of magnitude more problems than we're aware of today. Traditionally, there's been quite poor information sharing between stakeholders. There's real progress on that front. So people in my position and Chris's position are increasingly likely to coordinate with each other across publishers on joint policies, joint approaches, sharing information, of course, in a GDPR compliant way. Lack of standardization, particularly geographically and across subject areas, is still a problem. We're not going to solve that overnight, but again, progress is being made. And a point of debate is whether there should be regulations or sanctions within this space. At the moment, there's no regulator, as I mentioned before when I was speaking about COPE, but there's some adherence of that approach. What's the prognosis? It's quite a sad face there in the little emoji, but I don't think it's that bad. Depends what day you catch me on whether I think the prognosis is good or poor. I think real progress is being made. It's going to take a long time to clean up the historical messes that we're detecting, but where we are making great progress is now putting processes in place to detect these problems prior to publication and hopefully stopping that pollution of the published record and the waste of everybody's time in cleaning up those messes. What's needed? All of the obvious things that I've listed there. You know, Chris spoke previously to some open research practices that engender transparency, which will go a long way to helping prevent these type of problems. And I think an appreciation of incrementalism. We'd love to wave a magic wand and fix all of these problems. That's not going to happen. But there is little steps that are leading to quite a major shift and kind of more upbeat outlook in this space. I think I'll leave it there and take any questions.
Suzanne, thank you so much. That was fascinating. It's good to see also hard data in an area where there's often an awful lot of anecdote, and also, while obviously you're discussing some very serious issues, the breadth of resources that are available to help individuals and institutions try and prevent them from taking place and to mitigate them when they do happen. And it's also always interesting to hear about not just actual fraud and misconduct, but problems and mistakes and how they can be resolved. It is, I think, somewhat depressing to hear that lawyers' letters are becoming more common, though. Okay, so we've got some time for a few questions before the next session starts. First question was, someone who says that obviously higher education institutions or funders can help us well placed to establish whether an issue is caused by an honest error or misconduct. But what about situations where a researcher is independent and doesn't have an institutional affiliation?
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult, and I don't want to give the impression that it's easy even when there is somebody to contact at a fund or institute. There's great geographical discrepancy. I didn't speak much to variances in geographic incidence and responsiveness. I presume this is a predominantly UK audience. In my kind of league table, if you like, of countries that concern me the most, you'll be pleased to know that the UK is not at the top of that list. There's other countries in the world where it's much more difficult to even find anybody who takes care of research integrity at an institution or a funder. So what happens with an independent researcher? If we don't get what we need out of the author, and if we don't feel that we have sufficient information to make a decision on a case without what we need to be provided by the author, then unfortunately sometimes that will result in no action being taken. And I guess this is one of those areas where it could potentially speak to the need for some kind of global central regulator to which we could report an independent researcher who we suspected of misconduct. But I don't think we're anywhere near having that type of central regulation at this stage.
Thank you. Andrew asks, how do publishers guard against their own reviewers from stealing the work of the paper they're reviewing or making comments designed to prevent acceptance of the paper?
Yeah, not as well as we should, I would say. You know, in the 2.5 years I've been in this group, I think I came in with quite a naive outlook. I thought I knew quite a lot about research integrity and the kinds of things that have gone on, but I'm still surprised to this day about some of the types of behaviour that I see. You know, the research enterprise has traditionally, and I think correctly, been based on a paradigm of trust. You know, editors trust an author when they submit a paper that the author's generated the data, that they haven't stolen the paper. Peer reviewers have that trust as well, and reciprocally, editors and authors trust peer reviewers that they're doing the right thing and not trying to progress their own agenda by influencing an author of a paper that they're peer reviewing. Having said that, I've seen some hair-raising examples of peer reviewer misbehaviour. Some journals have very good checks in place to detect those type of things and to act against them. Some journals have nothing or completely ineffective processes. So one of the things, for example, we're doing at Springer Nature is basically doing an entire audit of that variety of practices, finding out where the gaps are. Often we focus those audits on journals where we're seeing a high incidence of research integrity cases in my team. And we very quickly work with the editorial team to patch up those holes. If we find resistance from an editor-in-chief to any of those changes that we think need to be made, we do our best to talk the editor-in-chief around. Editorial independence is a very dearly held concept, but if push comes to shove and an editor-in-chief won't get on board with the changes that need to be made, then we're not averse to replacing that editor-in-chief with somebody who'll do the right thing.
Thank you very much. That was good answers, and also answered a question I was about to pose to you, which is what happens if an editor-in-chief dismisses your recommendation and advice completely? And we now know there can be a new editor-in-chief instead. Thank you. An anonymous questioner asked, when a paper is being investigated, is it just that you look at the individual paper concerned, or do you also look at the other works by authors, reviewers, editors, etc.? Their involvement.
Okay. I shake my I shake my finger knowingly. It's not completely consistent. I mean, if I was going to pull every one of those threads on every issue that came to my team, I would probably need another 50 people in my team, which I don't have. So I do have to be judicious, but it's quite easy when you're familiar with these type of issues to suspect from features of an individual case or paper that this might be part of a larger systematic issue, for example, a paper that's come from a paper mill. So in those cases where we have a high index of suspicion, we have a database and a search interface that we've developed at Springer Nature that will allow us to detect any other historical or current submission from a particular author, a particular email address, a particular institution with the same title, etc., etc. So very often, and actually on the large case slide I showed you, there was a quite esoteric image there, but that was essentially a demonstration of the type of network mapping that we will do. We have a suspicion about an impersonation via a made-up email address, and we have gone and found that email address throughout the 3,000 Springer Nature journals, and we've mapped the network of the interactions of that email address with various authors, peer reviewers, editors, and papers, and then we can start to investigate those papers.
Fascinating, thank you. A comment from Ron Eprifen, who said there's even, with independent researchers, he notes there's even more difficulty for independent researchers gaining redress for misbehaviour by editors or peer reviewers. And then we have a question from Jane Alfred, who says, could you tell us a little more about how you see AI being used effectively to address some of the issues you discussed?
Yeah, sure. And I should preface this with that I'm not a technical person. I've come up editorially with words. So if I use the wrong technical terms, please forgive me. But things like we have a tool at Springer Nature now, for example, where we can plug in specific keywords and it will text mine submissions for flags that or features that are associated via our experience with a paper mill, for example, or we'll flag account names or email addresses that we know have been associated with past misconduct. So I'm not sure actually that AI is the right term here, but I guess the use of these large-scale, almost instantaneous tools to be able to flag these problems automatically to a person for investigation, and integrating some of those capabilities with other tools like text plagiarism detection software. For example, a tool that once the text plagiarism software has been run will automatically channel the OK manuscripts into the next phase of manuscript processing, whereas flagging those ones that are in the grey area or have a high degree of crossover back to a human for analysis.
Thank you. One final question, I think, before we go on to the final presentation, is Anthony asks, is there any ongoing work to better align how investigations into research misconduct between universities and publishers are conducted when there are implications for both organisations and individual case? I think as someone who we run a research integrity advisory body, we often hear from publishers saying they're having problems communicating with or liaising with research organisations, and equally from research organisations saying, and researchers saying they're having problems communicating with and liaising with publishers. So I think there's certainly scope for improvement on both sides here.
Yeah, there definitely is scope for improvement. It's on my long list of things to do. Unfortunately, I have some much more serious things that I feel I need to take care of first. Yes is the short answer, that there is efforts on that front. I think organisations like COPE are really helping here. I mean, COPE, traditionally membership has been for journals and publishers, but they're working on extending that to institutions, for example. And I think reasonably straightforward things like publishers knowing what research organisations are doing to check research integrity of papers before they're submitted. If we know what's already been checked, we don't necessarily have to repeat that work, and vice versa. If institutions are more informed about what we do as part of our checking, maybe they don't have to invest time and effort in doing the same thing. So there is absolutely a need, both on the preventive front and when a problem does arise, for better coordination between those two stakeholders. And I promise we'll get to it at some point in the future.
Brilliant, thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. Lots of great questions. I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to deal with all of them.